Hello, my name is Phil Gore. I'm the Director for Board Services for the Vermont School Boards Association, and I'm honored today to have 4 panelists with us who are going to be sharing some expertise and insight for new school board members. We want to welcome all of the new school board members to this webinar. We hope that you gain some insight and some tips for productive meetings and to better understand your budgets and oversight of financial management of the school district. We have some contact information on here on this slide. There's a phone number and the Vermont School Boards Association website where you'll find some information that can be valuable. Tonight's webinar is the second in a 2-part series, and we had a webinar just last week on May 5th that was introducing new school board members to this resource, the essential work of Vermont school boards. We would encourage you to view that webinar if you haven't already. And also all the new school board members in the state are giving a copy of that book. So if you haven't received yours in the mail yet, you should have it by the end of this week. And if not, please contact us. And my email address will be here at the end of our webinar. So just mentioning here, if you could use the chat, I will do my best to monitor the chat while our panelists are speaking, and I'll try to weave your question in if there's an appropriate time to interrupt someone with the question, or we'll save it for the end of a segment so that we can keep things moving along. After the webinar, probably tomorrow, you will receive a link that has a recording of this webinar, as well as some reference to other resources and slides that have been shared. So let us know if you have questions or there are additional ways that we can be of service to you. With us this evening are Neil Odell. Neil is the chair of the VSBA board, and he's also the vice chair of his school district. Cheryl Scarzello is director of finance for Slate Valley Unified School District, and we're honored to have her with us as well. Morgan Dabell is the business manager for Franklin Northeast Supervisory Union. And Nancy Russell is a member of the VSBA board, and she's a board member in the Hartford School District. So we want to welcome each of them. And as we jump into these conversations, we'll have opportunities for each person to introduce himself or herself as we go along. So we won't do that quite yet. Tonight, we want to think about what is important to know about budgeting and financial oversight. So you'll see some introduction, perhaps, to new terms that might be unfamiliar to you. For some of you in this webinar, the content may be things that you've already been exposed to or know about. If that's the case, we really encourage you to ask some thoughtful questions as we go along. Again, this is kind of an intent to cover a wide range of people and backgrounds. We know that school board members come from all walks of life and all different types of backgrounds, some with probably a lot of knowledge and information about public education finance in the state of Vermont, and some that may not have hardly any. But wherever you're at in that spectrum, we're really glad that you're with us tonight and joining us. We hope you get a lot out of this. So I'm going to stop sharing that screen so that Cheryl can share her slides. And she has some slides that will be helpful that she's used in her district when talking about budgeting and financing with the local community. Cheryl, I'll let you also introduce yourself if you want to say anything about yourself for people to know.
Thanks, Phil. As Phil said, my name is Cheryl Scarzello. I'm the Director of Finance for Slate Valley Unified Union School District. I've been a school business manager for 16 or 17 years, starting to lose a little bit of track. I've served in 2 school districts. I'm down here in Rutland County. Currently, my school districts are in Rutland County with one in Addison County, and previously I was in Rutland County. And my school district, Slate Valley, is a unified union school district. We merged on July 1st of 2019. Prior to that, I had 6 school districts and the SU. I'm very happy to be a unified union school district. It makes my job much simpler dealing with all our towns as one school district. So I'm going to be sharing with you some slides that we use in our budget presentation. The way we work in our district, you'll see the slides you see are part of the end product of what we use for our informational meeting. So where the presentation starts at the beginning of the year is a little bit different from where it ends, or at the beginning of the budgeting cycle. So the slides you're going to be seeing that relate to Slate Valley are related to a district that is a unified school district. So we're fully merged one district. So I'm going to pause and let Morgan introduce himself, because his district is a little bit different than mine. And so we'll share some slides from both of our presentations and then try to interject some of the differences that you might come across depending on the configuration of your school. And our intent is to show you how a school district goes from their budget that we work on for many months, from the budget to the tax rate that taxpayers are seeing on their tax bill. So hopefully we'll be able to walk you through all the steps and the components, and along the way explaining the different pieces of the funding formula as we hit them. So Morgan, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thanks, Cheryl. My name is Morgan Dabell, and I'm the business manager for Franklin Northeast Supervisory Union. I've been in this role for about 10 or so years, and then I was on one of my school boards for about 10 years prior to that. As Cheryl tipped, we are still in a supervisory union structure up here. I've got 6 towns, all in Franklin County. Prior to the Act 46 mergers, I had 5 towns, each was their own individual district. They had two K-12 towns and then 3 towns that operated K-8 and tuitioned their high school students out. Under the Act 46 merger, we were basically put into 2 districts. So our 2 high schools are now in a single district, and then our 3 K-8 schools are in a separate district, and we picked up a district that kind of matched that structure from a neighboring SU. So I went from 6 boards to 3 boards, which is better, but I'm pretty envious of folks like Cheryl who only have to do this process one time each year. If you look at the slide that's up right now, this is something that I use with my boards just to kind of let them know the timeline for getting to their budget. And so starting at the bottom, we have town meeting day, which is where my 2 districts, NMV and ERU, hold their budget votes. We back up about a week and a half from there to their in-person meetings, which are both at the end of February. And then backing up from that, I've got some notes in there just so I know, and so the board knows when our drop dead dates are for warning budgets, because we have to get the meeting warning into the papers. So that's kind of the bottom half of that. Going back up to the top, kind of walk you through the process we use, or the steps that we have in setting the budget. And that second column is for the supervisory union. And because the supervisory union budgets are not voted on directly by the electorate, the process there is a little bit different, and we work to get that budget finalized earlier because the assessment from the supervisory union is a big part of the two districts' budgets.
Morgan, can I interrupt just a moment?
Sure.
Cheryl, are you able to click on the slideshow there to put your slide in presentation mode?
Yes,
Toward
where,
the top
oh,
right.
there it is. Okay, sorry.
That's all right.
There we go.
Perfect. Thank you.
Excellent.
You're welcome. Thanks.
So the first time that I really start showing my boards a draft of the budget is in mid-October. Service plan is something that's sort of going away under Act 173, but that was basically our projection for the special education budget for the next year. So that's historically where we would start. In terms of the two district budgets, I normally will get information out to the principals and hope to have it back by the end of October. And then I can start building the local budgets based on that. And then you'll see once we hit our November board meetings is when I'm giving the board their first look at a budget draft. Second board meetings are in December. And then we tend to warn them either at a regular January meeting or if there's a reason to push that off at a later January meeting. And for us, because we have one town that operates the high schools, we are normally trying to get that budget finalized first because that will set their tuition rate, and a big part of our K budget is paying tuition to the high school district. There are 3 lines in here that are in green, and when Cheryl takes back over, she's going to be hitting a lot of these as we walk through the slides. These are the 4 pieces of the puzzle that set the tax rate every year. And so we as business managers do a lot of work with the boards and with the public, trying to make everybody understand what those 4 pieces are. And I know prior to this meeting, Neil shared the presentation he did at Norwich, and that was a really excellent walkthrough of a very arcane system for setting tax rates. The first number to drop is the yield proposal, which comes from the tax commissioner by December 1st of each year. And this is basically setting a projection for how much $1 on the tax rate is going to raise for the districts. The second big number to drop is the equalized pupil count. And we tend to get our first look at that around December 15th. And then that will get tweaked as Cheryl and I and other business managers reach out to the AOE and tell them they must have something wrong, and then we get them to correct that. The CLA is the third number that drops. That comes from the tax department as well, and that's usually at the end of December. And you know, these three levers for the tax rate are all very significant, and I think as board members, it's important to know, to keep in mind that these are the 3 that you have absolutely no control over. The legislature is going to set the yield. Equalized pupils are based on formulas and statutes, and the CLA is a calculation done to equalize property values over the state, and that's not in your wheelhouse either. That last green line there, the finalized budget and signing the warning, that for most of us happens in January. And this is really the only piece of the puzzle where boards and the administration and ultimately the voters have some control over what will eventually end up to be your tax rate. So Cheryl, that's all I have on this. If you want to kind of go into your presentation.
Sure, great, thanks.
Morgan, for those that may not know, what is CLA?
It's called Common Level of Appraisal. And so that is the state's attempt to insert some fairness into the tax appraisal system. So we have 250 or so different entities that are going out and setting assessments on the properties. They do that. Some do it more frequently than others. Some do it maybe more professionally than others. And so what the state does is it looks at property sales in all of those towns, and it comes up with a formula to basically to change the assessments in towns where they feel like the town grand list is getting either below market or above market.
Thank you.
So as Morgan alluded to, and we'll touch on this more as we go along, the purpose of the formula as it steps through each of these components that Morgan has identified, the purpose is to equalize these different components, pupils, property values across the entire state. And so that's what the formula is doing. And I'm just going to read you a little something I do for my school board. I send them out a little report and I kind of remind them of some of these things. So just so I make sure that I hit on kind of that higher level of education funding in the state of Vermont. So as you may or may not know, as a result of the Vermont Supreme Court Brigham decision in 1997, the state aided local tax system for funding education in the state of Vermont was replaced by a state funded system. So the state pays each district the amount needed to fund the district's locally adopted budget through the education fund. And the amount funded through the education fund is each district's education spending. And so I'll point that out when we get there, what education spending is. So in my district, and I'm sure, again, as I refer to my district, but I think even when Morgan and I spoke, it's our process is similar. So we believe it's probably very similar all throughout the state. So early on in the timeline, we start meeting with the board, the superintendent and I and other administrators in the district, and we kind of have a higher level conversation about the upcoming budget and what the objectives may be that we need to incorporate into our budget and our funding for the upcoming year. So you can see here some of the budget objectives that we identified for Slate Valley. We are in the process in FY23 of bringing all our 7th and 8th graders onto our high school campus and changing the configuration of our elementary schools to pre-K to 6s. Our high school will become a 7 to 12. So that formulated a lot of the decisions that we were making about our budget for fiscal year 23. And in conjunction with that, we needed to do some building maintenance. We needed to do some construction projects. So that those objectives drove the decisions that we made about how we were going to put together our budget. And so I would imagine that you as well in your districts, you start with a conversation with the board about what the objectives might be. Maybe there's a new program that you wish to start. Perhaps you are just offering one language and you want to offer 2 languages, or you have some other educational programs that you want to undertake, or perhaps you have some building maintenance that you need to focus on. So you have those conversations so everybody is focused on what they want to accomplish with the budget. So you can see here some of those other things that we show as objectives, and some of these are pretty broad and are similar in most districts, I would say. So then, besides those broad objectives, again, keeping in mind that this presentation is representative of the final product. But as I go along, I'll start identifying for the board additional things that are impacting the budget and the numbers that are going into the budget. So some of those things that were impacting it for FY23 are an increase in the percentages of students that have social and emotional needs due to COVID. Health insurance is often a consideration and what that increase is. We had other increases in payroll costs. We had decreases due to some retirement buyouts. We had a little change in equalized pupils. We had changes in common level of appraisal. Some of our towns decreased, some increased. And my district subsidizes our food service program because we're a provision 2 school, and we've been providing meals free for all students in our district for the last 2 years. So that has an impact on the budget. And so I'm just bringing these things to the board's attention, and then when we have an informational meeting, likewise to our taxpayers. So often warnings for the warnings whenever your budget is voted on may include other articles that are voted on at the same time. For us, for fiscal year 23, we had an article for a transfer from our surplus funds to our capital improvements and repairs reserve fund. Again, in speaking with Morgan, he also has a similar article. And there could be any number of articles, different articles. A couple years ago, we purchased a piece of land that was adjacent to one of our one of our school properties. And so that was an article to get voter approval to purchase that land. So again, that's something that early on, when you're starting your budget cycle, the administrators in your building will discuss with you other articles that may be necessary for whatever is going on in your district. So surplus funds come into play in the development of a school district budget because they become part of revenue, and revenue is a part of education spending. So I have a discussion with the board via this slide about what our general fund surplus has been. And we, like many other districts, these last few years have been running fairly good sized surpluses, mostly because of COVID and the activities that we've not been able to do, transportation, certain educational programs, athletics over the course of fiscal 20 and fiscal 21 that were impacted by COVID, as well as we've also been impacted because we've not been able to fully staff. We've budgeted for positions that have been vacant. So all of that contributes to the surplus in the district. So we will look at how that surplus gets used, and we'll commit some of it to a subsequent year's budget. And then we will also commit some in my district to our capital projects reserve. So you can see here where I'm showing how we committed some of our 21 surplus to our 22 budget and our capital projects reserve, which was voted on by our voters in March of 21. And then I'm showing the board and taxpayers what was available for the fiscal year 23 budget. The board in discussion with the board, again, because we've got a lot of things going on with buildings in our district, wanted to do another good transfer to our capital projects reserve so we can address some of those building needs, as well as what we may have voted or what we may have included in our regular annual budget. We have these funds that we'll set aside for capital projects. And then finally, that leaves an amount available for our fiscal year 23 budget. This amount, sometimes it's referred to as cash to open. It's use of prior year surplus, and that goes into revenue, which reduces the expenditure budget and determines education spending. So here is the budget article for Slate Valley. And so the amounts highlighted in green will become the key components of determining the tax rate. And you'll see throughout the presentation, I've tried to highlight these amounts again in green so you can see how it works through from starting with your expenditure budget to determining a tax rate. So for Slate Valley, the expenditure budget is $26 million. So that's the entire expenditure budget for running all the programs. It's total expenditures without any revenue offsets. So the voters must approve that dollar amount. So here it is in the article. So that's the question: shall the voters approve this dollar amount for the ensuing fiscal year? Also recently, I think it's been in the last, I don't know, Morgan, I think this is maybe the 4th or 5th year, I can't quite remember, that we've had additional language in the warning by statute that says we have to provide what the estimated education spending per equalized pupil is. And we also have to state what that change in education spending per equalized pupil is from the prior year. So in the case of my district, it was 2.94%. And again, we'll work our way down in each of these components so you can see how they come into play. So I'll just pause for a second in case there's any questions at this point.
We don't have any in the chat, so if someone would like to ask a question, feel free to unmute and ask or put one in the chat, either way. Neil, is there anything you would like to add or sort of underscore in the last few slides?
I think the one thing I want to point out, so for brand new school board members, I will say, holy cow, is the funding formula complex, right? So I think it probably, I was on the board, I don't think that they really fully understood, probably still don't, the funding for it. It took me about 8 years to really sort of wrap my head around this. And the one thing that I would encourage new board members to do is at least take that first step. The VSBA has some other videos that cover how education financing works in the state. View those videos because it gives you a good basic understanding of how sort of all of this stuff goes together. I will say that with one caveat, however, is that it's about to change. So this legislative session is hopefully probably going to end by tomorrow. They're changing one aspect of the funding formula. And I would love to be able to tell you guys that it's going to get more, it's going to get simpler. Instead, I think it's actually going to get a little bit more complex. But start with those videos that we have available at the VSBA website on education financing, and then work your way out from there. And don't be depressed if you don't get it the first time around, because there's a lot to it.
Nancy,
I would agree with that. And I would say the biggest of the big pictures for the funding formula is that it is designed so that if Cheryl's district is going to spend 16,900 per kid, and Neil's district's going to spend 16,900 per kid, and Nancy's is, and mine is, that the tax rate is going to be the same for someone who is in a $200,000 house in each of those districts with a $70,000 income, let's say. It's really meant so that that the lift for paying for education is shared somewhat equally across the state.
Thanks, Morgan. Yep, that's the big takeaway in Vermont, is all these components are trying to equalize that and make that the same statewide. And then I'll show you in my presentation where things diverge a little bit in terms of the tax rates in each of your towns. So this breaks down for you where we go from the expenditure budget, which is $26 million, and that's the amount that appears on the warning. That's that bright green number there. Education spending is the expenditure budget less the local revenues. So in my case, 4.6 million. So that brings education spending down to 21,631,000. So in the case of my district, the expenditure budget decreased slightly. Revenues decreased as well. So education spending has increased about $500,000 for Slate Valley for fiscal year 23. So that can also be hard to understand, is that despite the fact that we decreased our expenditure budget, education spending is still showing an increase, and that's because you can see those change in local revenues. And I will break that down further so you can see what happened there. Again, trying to show you what happens in my district, so when you look at what happens in your district, you can relate to that. So then equalized pupils, as Morgan said, is an amount that's provided to school districts by the AOE. It's based on our census information that we provide to the agency. They average 2 years of enrollment, they apply weights, and then equalized pupils are determined. So that's a formula. And as Neil alluded to, that's one of the components of the formula that the legislature is currently changing or looking at changing. So the weights for pupils take into account that it costs more to educate certain types of students. For example, secondary students, students for whom English may not be their first language, as well as students that are living in poverty. So the equalized pupils weights these students differently, so that in the case of my district, if I have a significant number of English language learners in my district compared to Morgan, who maybe Morgan only has 1 or 2, but maybe I have 20. For example, Winooski has a lot of English language learners. So it costs more to educate those students. So their weight is greater in terms of determining equalized pupils. So again, equalized pupils is a way of equalizing the types of pupils in each school district throughout the state of Vermont. Because if you were a school district, let's say if you were a school district that didn't have any high school students, the cost of educating your elementary students might be significantly less than a district that has many high school students. So that all has to be taken into account when looking at equalized pupils. And that's what the state is doing there. So that could be tricky to understand because equalized pupils is not equivalent to the number of students that may be in your building at any given time. And education spending per equalized pupil is not your expenditure budget divided by enrollment. And that is often something that people want to try to do. They want to say, well, you know, they want to just be able to take the budget and divide it by the number of students in the building and saying, well, that's what it costs per pupil. Well, when we're looking at it statewide, not necessarily. So education spending per equalized pupil is what we use. And we have to, in the warning, provide to the taxpayers what that change in education spending per equalized pupil was compared to the prior year. So in my case, it was an increase of 2.94%. So that change is a factor of the change in the expenditure budget, the change in local revenues, and the change in equalized pupils. All are part of that overall change in education spending per equalized pupil.
Cheryl, there was a question in the chat that I don't know if one of the four of you are able to answer. It may go to a comment made earlier. Is the legislature looking at making the tax rate more dependent on income than on property value plus income? Have any of you heard of a move that direction? Neil? Yeah.
Sure, unless somebody else wants to chime in. So the short answer is they are looking at that. So I believe the bill that just passed and is headed to the governor's desk for signature includes the creation of a committee in there, a study group, to look into moving to an income-based financing model or an income-based taxation model for raising the education revenue. I say that acknowledging that we actually already have that kind of in place already today. So for those folks that aren't familiar with it, if you've heard people talk about income sensitivity as a method for paying your property taxes, that's a way that Vermont currently now adjusts what a person or a family would pay for property taxes if your income falls below a certain threshold. And there are gradations for that I'm sure our business managers know those numbers way better than I do. But currently, if your income falls below a certain level, what you pay for your property taxes is then reduced or based on that income level as well. And I believe if I look at it from a statewide level, I think that almost, I want to say 60%, 2/3 of Vermonters already pay, I believe, based on income sensitivity.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think the other challenge with that, and I don't know if we'll get into it in this presentation, is that residential property tax is not as big a piece of the funding pie as most people think. I don't know the breakdown right off the top of my head, but let's say roughly a quarter of ed funding is coming from sources not tied to property at all. So that would be rooms and meals and lottery and other income streams there. And then of the remaining 75%, the lion's share of that, maybe 2/3 of that, I would guess, is coming from non-residential property. And so moving to an income tax rather than the income-based sensitivity that we have, you really need to figure out how to not lose that 50% of the pie that's non-residential property tax.
Yep. Thanks. So if there are no other questions, then I'll keep moving along here. So this breaks down what makes up local revenue. So here I'm demonstrating that the amount of the use of prior year surplus. So you can see in the case of this budget, it's a decrease, and that's primarily driving this decrease in the local revenue budget, is this decrease in the amount of use of prior year surplus. And we've got special education sources that are considered local. We have some transportation revenue sources, and then other miscellaneous sources, things like gate receipts and other revenues that school districts get. So the expenditure budget, less local revenue, is education spending. We take education spending, divide it by the equalized pupils, and we get education spending per equalized pupil. Then we compare the education spending per equalized pupil to the prior year's amount, and that is the change in education spending. So again, you can see here, this change is being driven by a small decrease in the expenditure budget, a larger decrease in local revenues, so an overall increase in education spending, a little decrease for us in equalized pupils. So that change is $485 or 2.94%. So these amounts in green are what appear on the warning for school district budgets. So Morgan and I, when we were looking at this, we thought it would be useful just to for you to look at what the typical breakdown of a budget is. And I would say my breakdown is probably similar to most districts across the state. So this looks at the budget, breaking it down by expenditure accounts. So you can see here that primarily the budget is driven by employee wages and employee benefits. And then you can see here other services, including transportation, tuition, insurance, and then we're moving down here into the smaller pieces of the pie in terms of supplies, including electricity, some purchase services, equipment, dues, debt, and fees. And I think it's important to understand this because the point is that the focus should really be on staffing in your budget and the personnel that you need to support the programs in your district. Sometimes the focus can get down here into some of these smaller components of the overall budget, but I think it's really important to stay focused here. 75% of the budget is related to personnel. So it's really important to talk about the staff that you need to provide the education and the programs in your district and support students in your districts that are necessary. It's easy to be down in some of these areas because it's a little easier to understand. But again, really focusing on employee wages and benefits is really important in terms of keeping your focus on the larger components of a school district's budget. This is the same budget, again, broken down in just a little bit of a different way. We call these functional areas. So you can see here in my budget, 50% is devoted to direct instruction. So those are teachers in classrooms and costs related to things that are going on in classrooms with students. And then as we move around here again, you can see building operation and maintenance is a big component for us, again, because of some of the things that we're doing in Slate Valley, administration, student support, transportation, on and on, athletics, and a little piece of debt here. So And in some districts, debt might be a bigger component. In Slate Valley, we have very little debt. We're using other resources to try to deal with some of our building needs. That can vary very much from district to district. But again, it's important to understand how that $26 million in the case of Slate Valley is being used to support these programs and functional areas in our district.
Yeah, and I would say that our district, the breakdowns are very similar. And as new board members, I echo what Cheryl was saying about focus on the personnel costs. Don't worry about that little tiny yellow slice of the pie that's supplies, because as she has in there, it's supplies, but your light bill comes out of there, your fuel bill, your wood chips, whatever. And so in terms of the concerned voters who are going to stand up and tell you that you really need to be in a pencil buying cooperative to drive down the costs of the pencils that you buy each year, the money's just not there. And as board members, your focus shouldn't be there.
I was going to ask, are these pretty typical, especially on transportation? That transportation percentage seemed a little bit lower than I would anticipate in a lot of districts.
I think it depends, at least on the first one, it'll depend on whether your bus drivers are your employees or if you contract it out. So we contract it out completely. We don't hire bus drivers. And so in our pie chart, it's going to look like it's a little bit bigger under that contracted services and less under personnel.
There's a question in the chat too about where do insurance costs fall? And I'm not sure if people mean health insurance, because that would be in the employee benefits, but where would, and then other insurance there for property insurance, liability. Thank you.
Right. So insurance for related to employees, so health, dental, those types of insurances are going to appear here in this chart under employee benefits. Then we also have insurance, property insurance, and liability insurance, and that is incorporated in here into this piece of our pie here. When you look at it this way, insurance is maybe a little bit more spread out, although I think a lot of it ends up landing here in building operations and maintenance. There's some in administration for liability and coverage for school board liability. And again, looking this way, the cost of health insurance is going to be spread among personnel that are incorporated in direct instruction, in building maintenance, in administration, and student support. So looking at it this way, there's wage and benefit costs included in nearly all these components of this pie chart, as opposed to looking at it this way, where all the personnel costs are incurring here.
Cheryl, there was another question in the chat earlier, and it has to do with the display of data. Do your community members tend to respond favorably to pie charts? This is easy for them to make sense of, and Neil or Nancy may want to weigh in on that too.
I have found, we're trying to convey a lot of information simply and quickly. It's hard to get through all of this, and we've just found that this helps to illustrate a point that we're trying to make rather than another table. I mean, we're providing all kinds of detailed information, and the detailed budget is on our website, and we have the breakout in dollars of all these functional areas available. But for typically for budget presentations, we use a combination of tables and charts, just makes it easier to get through all the information.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would echo that as well too. Count me as one of those people. If you show me a table of numbers on a slide in a presentation, I probably glaze over it immediately. I much more like the visual stuff, especially if you're just like giving a budget presentation, a bunch of front of people. I like to have as little information on the slide as possible and make it somewhat visual so that people can just get it from looking at it.
This is Nancy. We switched over a couple of years ago and broke budgeting down to as simplistic as we could. And one of the things to present to our tax people, our tax, not our tax people, but our community members, so they could better understand it. And one of the things that we did was we switched over to some of the pie charts, and we got a very good response from the community in that form. It says, oh, now I can see it. So I think a lot of people, like Neil said, need to see that visual, and this is a real easy thing for them to see.
I like it.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that, and I would also just say that be thoughtful about who's doing the presentation. As I had said, I have 2 districts, and in one of my districts, the board feels that it's important for a board member to do that. And so I work with her, and we prepare the slides together, and I, help her with the script, but she really runs with it when we get into that meeting. And then in my other district, the board feels like that's the business manager and the superintendent's job. And so we're the ones doing it there. And it, it works for both. It's a completely local choice. And each system, I think, approaches it a little differently.
So moving on into getting to tax rates. So now that we have education spending for equalized pupil, and you'll note here that I say it's estimated, and that's because when you're signing the warning at the end of January, we often don't have finalized equalized pupils. I think we used to have finalized equalized pupils, but we don't anymore. And so I'm always very careful to try to say this is estimated. And the reason it's estimated is because equalized pupils are not finalized. It's an amount that the state is providing to us, and they're compiling all that information at the state level. And so we get different versions, but we don't usually have a final one. So education spending for equalized pupil is estimated. So that gets divided by the homestead property yield. And as Morgan pointed out in his timeline, the tax commissioner of the state of Vermont provides a letter to, it's addressed to the governor and the legislature. Morgan, I'm trying to remember. It's
Yes, I believe so.
Governor and the legislature, and the tax commissioner is looking at the condition of the education fund, looking at information that he or she is receiving from the Agency of Education with regard to some feedback about what districts are giving the AOE, about where we're thinking budgets may come, and using all that information to determine and give the legislature the homestead property yield. And so this letter goes to superintendents, and business managers get a copy of it. And it has a lot of information in it. And in the case of this year, he actually had 2 amounts, and you may have heard about this because of the surplus in the education fund, and of $90 million, the tax commissioner was providing information about the yield based on how much of that surplus might go back to taxpayers in the form of increasing the yield in order to lower tax rates for taxpayers. So that's a really key component of this, because somewhere along the line, in order to estimate tax rates, we have to determine an amount to use for the homestead property yield. And it's not an amount that's been set by the legislature. Even now, I don't believe it's been set, at least not that I've heard. And if the session is ending soon, I would think it has to, they have to set it. So we'll be finding out in the next day or two. So as a school district, we have to decide what we're going to use. So we look at the information that's coming in from the tax commissioner about the yield. And then as we go throughout the budget process, we may get some additional information from the Agency of Education, which might lead a school district to use a different amount. Again, each district handles this differently. And in both our districts, Morgan and I talked about how we talk with the board about this decision that we're making about what yield we should use in order to estimate tax rates for our taxpayers. Because we're providing an estimate of tax rates based on a lot of information that's not set. There's a lot of variables here. And so we want to make sure that we're clear in providing that information to taxpayers, because I think it's important in terms of credibility for the administration of the school district and the school board. We certainly don't want to provide tax rates. We want to provide the best estimate that we have with the information that we have at the time of what the tax rate may be. But certainly in early March, there are many variables that go into this, and that's really important to understand, that we're estimating tax rates at this point. So when we take education spending per equalized pupil and divide it by the homestead property yield, we get the estimated equalized tax rate. So Slate Valley has one equalized tax rate because we're a unified union school district. And so this is the rate before each town's common level of appraisal is applied. And again, I have some charts that will show you how that starts to change the tax rate that appears on the bill from the town. So this estimated equalized tax rate is not yet the tax rate that shows on a bill for a taxpayer. This is the tax rate for Slate Valley District as a whole. Again, a little bit tricky to understand at this point. So this shows you, it helps to show you what has happened with the equalized homestead tax rate in my towns from 2015 to 2023. And this again is before the common level of appraisal is applied. So up until 2019, I had all the school districts had separate budgets. Each budget was voted on separately. And so we ran through all these calculations for each school district. Each district had its own budget. Each school district had its own equalized pupils. So each district had its own equalized tax rate. So you can see here all the towns that make up Slate Valley, and you can see the fluctuations and the different tax rates for each town. But you can see here in 2019, as we merged and we moved along further and further from our initial merger, you can see here now that we have one tax rate for all towns in Slate Valley, and that's the equalized tax rate. So that's because we're a unified union school district. We're one school district, it's one budget for all these towns. And the reason it's not the same right when we merge is because as districts merge in statute, the calculation of that equalized tax rate, there's some incentives that the state gives, and there's also some adjustments in that final calculation. So everybody is gradually moving towards that one equalized rate rather than somebody coming up, coming up or coming down a lot in 1 year. So it's a gradual move to this equalized tax rate for the town. So I'll stop there for a second in case there are some questions. All right.
There is one in the Q&A. I don't know if we've
Okay.
addressed it or not.
Okay.
It's about the expenditure, the chart by functional area.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I'm not sure I understand the question, but I think it's around the difference between that and basically the difference between the two pie charts. So the first one that Cheryl had up there is basically what we're buying. So we're buying salaries, we're buying benefits, we're buying that little slice of pie, that's stuff. And then when you move to the functional area, it's more, why are we buying it? We're buying some of those things for direct instruction. Some of them are for student support. Some of it's for the administration. Some of it's for maintaining the building. So that's the difference between those two.
I think that's a great explanation. Even, what we're buying are those accounts where you saw salary, benefits. And another way for functional area might be to say what we're doing. So that's how the funds are spent based on what we're doing, if that helps to explain that. So, now we start moving into how the common level of appraisal impacts the tax rate for each town in a district. And I'm going to hop here for a moment and then go back again. So this shows the common level of appraisal for each town in my district. So unlike the equalized tax rate that started to come together here after fiscal year 2019, because we merged, the common level of appraisal is unique to each town. We get a letter from it's the Vermont Department of Taxes, I think, is where we're getting it from. And they look at property sales. I think it's for 3 years, it's prior years, it's for a certain period, and they look at those sales versus appraised values. And that goes into determining the common level of appraisal. So you can see here for my towns, for some of them, the common level of appraisal is staying pretty steady. And for others of them, it is fluctuating more significantly. I would say, for example, in the case of Benson, Benson is a small town. So a few sales in a particular year can have an impact on that common level of appraisal. Whereas I think what you see in larger towns, that it may be a little bit more steady because they may not be as impacted significantly by fewer sales. So The common level of appraisal is also changing from one year to the next. And a decrease in the common level of appraisal increases the tax rate, and an increase in the common level of appraisal decreases the tax rate. So they have an inverse relationship, the common level of appraisal to the tax rate. So again, you can see here, I have some towns that had an increase, a couple towns that had a decrease. So that common level of appraisal, when it's applied to the school district's equalized tax rate. So here's the Slate Valley equalized tax rate. Everybody starts for all towns with that same equalized tax rate. Then we apply the common level of appraisal, which is different for each town. So that results in a different homestead tax rate, again, estimated, for each town in my district. And again, so then likewise, the dollar change for each town is different. So again, those common level of appraisals are different for each town. So that results in tax rates that are different for each town. So even here in fiscal year 19 and 20, where we merged, so where you saw the equalized tax rate being the same for all towns in my district, once the common level of appraisal is applied to that equalized tax rate, the resulting homestead tax rate for each town is now different.
And yeah, the reason for that again, and Cheryl, if you can go back to the slide that has all those ungodly numbers, the one that has more numbers on it. Yeah, that one. So the reason for that is the state, they're not looking at an individual house, but if we can use that as an example, the CLA for Orwell is at roughly 100%. So if the town of Orwell assessed my house at $100,000, it means that the state also thinks it's worth $100,000. If you look at Castleton, it's got a 90% CLA. So the state is coming in and say, well, Castleton's got your property appraised at $100,000, but we think it's worth $110,000. And so to make up for that, we're going to apply the CLA and your tax rate's going to go up a little bit.
So any questions there before we move on? Because so this is the estimate here again of the tax rate for each town in my district. Again, estimated because we don't have finalized equalized pupils. We don't know what that number is. And we also have made a decision about the yield that we use in determining this tax rate. So we do know the common level of appraisal. That's set unless a town is being reappraised, in which case it may not be set. And we know what the budget is. We know what local revenue is. Equalized pupils is not set. We don't know what the yield is for sure. We do know what the common level of appraisal is. So there are some things that we do know, some things that we don't know for sure. So that's why we will all say that this is an estimate of what the tax rate is for the town. And then, as Neil mentioned, some taxpayers will pay their taxes based on income or some combination of income and the value of their property. And I give taxpayers and the board some information about that. And I think Neil I think he said 70%. And you can see here, and looking at the towns in my district, that, yeah, that's probably, you know, if we were to average this, it's probably somewhere in there in terms of the percent of taxpayers that are receiving some credit on their education tax. And there's a spectrum in there in terms of how much of a credit. So this is just the percent that are receiving some sort of credit. And then there's another percent that are getting homeowner rebates. I also give them that information. And then we also, as part of this, in order to determine the credits for taxpayers, that is based on the household income percentage, and that is comes out as part of the formula. And you can see here a change in that percentage. So in the case of my district, that's gone down. So at this point, I'm happy to take questions, and but also Morgan was going to show you some information about some slides and some things that he does in his district, again, because he's not merged, and he has to prepare budgets not only for the supervisory union, but for each school district that is part of his supervisory union.
Yeah, so I'll start by saying that I do a similar presentation for the voters that Cheryl just presented. Mine tends to be briefer and maybe bigger picture, and we just kind of speed through that and get to questions. And that's something that, you know, you'll have to decide what your voters are used to and what's working for your district. This is a flyer that we send out in addition to the information that we put in the town books that tends to be a little denser. And I just wanted folks to be able to see it, that, you know, we're walking through for our two districts here on the left side. We're walking through the tax rate in the same way. We're, you know, taking the money that we're going to spend less the money that we know we're going to get from somewhere else, and that gives you the education spending. We divide that by the equalized pupils, the per pupil spending. We divide it by the yield. We get that district level tax rate, and then I will show each of the towns in here for the two districts and show what the CLA does to their town tax rate. And then on the right side, you know, we have information on where to vote, but we are also putting our per pupil spending in context with our county average and the state average, basically because for us, this is a good story. If I was in a town where I was in the top, you know, 2 inches of this chart, I wouldn't be trumpeting that, but it does work for us. And so this, I think I would say we'd be optimistic if 10% of the people who get the town books are actually reading the reports that are in there. We know that turnout at the annual meetings is relatively low, and although they're now zoomed and recorded, we're probably not reaching that many more people. So this level of detail is, I think, what I am able to get in front of the most hands or the most eyes as it goes from, you know, the mailbox to the recycling bin and in the post office. And so it's not that we've dumbed it down, but we've really tried to distill this down to as little necessary information as possible, and hope that if folks are interested, they'll you know, make the effort to read the town book or reach out to a principal or an administrator. And then we haven't really talked about it, but I think part of the agenda was also about your role in terms of, now the budget's passed and you're in September, October, December, whenever you are in the year, and how are you keeping your administration accountable to that budget? So this is something that I put out to my boards on a monthly basis. I think most districts do this, both at this level and at this frequency, although there's some exceptions. And basically what I'm showing them, again, on a big picture level, at that functional level, is this is the budget that the voters gave you in the spring, the adopted budget. If we've made any changes along the way, that would show up in the current budget. The next column would be what we've spent or taken in April, what we've spent or taken in for the year to date. And then the second to last column, the encumbrance receivable, is sort of what we know we're going to spend going on for the end of the year. So this tends to just be salaries and benefits. If we've started paying a teacher in September, our accounting software knows how much we're going to pay them in June, and it will project that out. I don't get into how much of this is salaries or how much of this is benefits, or, there are some systems that maybe go down to, this is what health insurance costs and this is what dental insurance costs. I really want to give my boards a big picture look and give them enough information so if they are concerned, they can look at something like this and say, okay, you say you're going to be $40,000 overspent in special education. Why is that? But I don't want them coming to me and saying, you're going to be $5 overspent on workers' compensation for your guidance counselor. Don't you know how to budget?
And let's see, I just threw this in, and I think Phil mentioned this at the beginning, and I'm sorry, it's a little blurry, but this is just a screenshot from the Vermont Department of Taxes. I know the VSBA has lots of resources, and with regard to the funding formula and how tax rates are calculated, as does the Department of Taxes. They have an FAQ here that goes into, again, all these components that we've looked at today. I think that's it.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, Morgan. Do we have any questions from participants at this point? Questions on school finances, budget oversight? Nancy and Neil, do you have questions or comments related to this, just really in your experience as a school board member? What are some sticky points for you, your board, your community? Are there some commonly asked questions by community members? Psychologically, I know it's always what's in it for me. And part of this presentation here, I'm trying to figure out now, how is what I'm doing affecting my tax rate or my neighbors, any of that kind of thing. But I'm curious, are there some commonly asked questions across the state among community members?
Nancy, you want to give it a go?
Well, I think one of the most common questions that we always get when we're presenting the budget to the community is, well, why is it so much? And again, what can't you cut down? Why can't you cut this down? We are old people. We don't even have kids in school. Why are we even paying school taxes? And now that we're paying them, why can't you make them less for people like us? Or but one of the things I'd like to say to the new members on boards is, don't hesitate to ask questions. I mean, I remember the first year I was on the school board, and I thought, I'm not going to ask that question. They'll think I'm stupid. And I have owned my businesses all my life, and so I understand P&Ls and all of this stuff. But to get down to the nitty gritty and what was being presented to us at the time, there was, as someone said a while ago, I think it was Morgan, says, the page has got all of those numbers on it. And I think that sometimes as new school board members, if you've not been familiar with how the school board sets their budgets and how they come up with these numbers and where they come from, could be a little daunting if you've not had to do this kind of work. So I encourage the new members to ask questions. Say, wait a minute, I don't understand this. And one of our school board members that is no longer on the board, but she was at the time when we decided that we needed to make it a more simplistic presentation to our public, got us thinking on that same lines. Well, if this person is not understanding it, then obviously our community members not either. So again, I just encourage the new members, ask lots of questions. If you don't understand it, ask.
We have a question for Neil that came in the chat here. I'm going to say the question is for Neil. Would you please address how VSBA is able to negotiate benefit expenses for all districts? How can we as a block negotiate with insurance, et cetera, to keep them as low as possible, knowing that we schools have some power in this area would be helpful? How do you respond to that one, Neil?
Sure. So for folks that may be unfamiliar or new to this, it used to be in years past that each school district negotiated with their local bargaining unit, and you negotiated over both salary and benefits. And the benefits were, by and large, the health benefits. Back in, I want to say 2018, the state, through an act of the legislature, moved to what we now call statewide bargaining for school employee health insurance. So we have a commission of folks that are appointed by the VSBA. We appoint 5 commissioners to this panel. The Vermont NEA and the other unit, the other bargaining unit with his AFSCME, appoint members to the panel as well too. And now healthcare benefits are negotiated at the state level, and that means that premium and out-of-pocket expenses are determined by that set of negotiations and are now the same for every school district in Vermont. Prior to that, school districts were able to negotiate those benefits locally, so you would find that, you know, the premium and out-of-pocket costs would vary by school districts. But as of 4 years ago, it's done at the state level. How local school districts can to support that work is to stay in touch with VSBA, with the employer commissioners. What I'm going to do after I get done here is I will pop into a chat a website for the employer commissioners, so the commissioners that are working on behalf of school boards. It's a website that they maintain that provides information on the status of bargaining when it's in session, what the issues are, you know, what the main themes are, the things that we want to address. And it's also a website that's got a whole host of information on maybe everything that you wanted to know about school employee healthcare, but we're afraid to ask. It's all there. And so I would say stay engaged with the process. There are ways to get in touch with the employer commissioners there. And then certainly reach out to VSBA or to the employer commissioners if you have any questions. And I'll grab that URL for folks and drop it in the chat.
Thank you, Neil, for being here to answer that question today.
And I think the other side of that is the other side of the negotiating. So all school districts are members of the Vermont Educator Health Initiative, which is basically it's not self-insured, but it's like a co-op for health insurance for all the school districts. And there's a sister organization that most of us are members of that does the less sexy insurance, the property insurance, the liability insurance. And so as an individual district, we're not having to go out to Blue Cross Blue Shield and MVP or to go out to any of the property insurers and try to get rates. We've sort of already pulled together as a state to do that.
Morgan and Cheryl, there's another valuable question here in the chat that people are asking about. Are there particular areas in the budget where school board member perspectives can be particularly helpful in the budget revision? Where is that opportunity for boards to have an impact?
Well, as I said at the beginning, we have that really high level conversation about what the objectives are for the upcoming budget and how are those going to be incorporated into that. And I would say we're doing that throughout the process, and probably that's getting a little bit more detailed as we're putting information out to the community via board meetings. We'll share what the focus and what the objectives are of the budget. I'm assuming that school board members are getting some feedback from that, from their communities. Then they're coming back to board meetings with that. And we're talking about that some more, talking about how to incorporate that into the budget if we're able to, or if we're not able to, how we explain why that decision was made not to. So I would say we're looking for that perspective throughout the process, and to the extent we can make revisions, we will, up to a certain point. So at the end of January is when the warnings are signed. And so typically that's the point at which that the budget is set in terms of what the voters are voting on. That.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. And I think, you know, any constructive input is helpful, but what is most helpful is when we're sitting down in those November meetings and the administration is saying, you know, we're feeling like we need to hire another pre-K teacher and do some building for another classroom in school X, and here are the reasons. And really to have board members at that point, you know, checking our thinking on that. Is that really the biggest need in the district? Is that going to be worth the 1 penny tax increase? Are there other solutions? You know, how is that going to impact the non-monetary balls that you guys need to pay attention to? How is it going to impact, you know, the results that we're getting for students? It's really those high level questions is where the most functional boards are spending their time.
That's great. I appreciate that. And I think we'll maybe underscore some of that here in the next half hour, but we had one more question and then we'll move into effective meetings. So what is the process if a community votes down the budget? Then what happens?
Well,
Cheryl's
unfortunately,
got this one.
I know. So despite 2.94 increase in education spending per equalized pupil, that Slate Valley budget that I showed you was voted down, which is not unusual for Slate Valley. We often have budget failures. Fortunately, when we put the budget out for revote in April, it did pass. So you have to continue to vote on a budget until you have a passed budget. And there's just, you have to keep voting. So you go back out, you reconvene as a board, you discuss the feedback, you know, try to ascertain why it voted down, how you can address that. And then you determine what the new amount is that you might present to the voters, and do a revote. So you're having to, again, put out information. We do the same thing. We've got flyers that are 2-page summary. You know, go out to the papers, get information out, let voters know that it will be revoted, when it'll be revoted, what's changed, and again, trying to understand why it was voted down and address that if you can. Our budget, we lost by 9 votes in March. It was recounted, and so it was 8. We've had larger margins. We actually think we ran into a problem because the ballot for our budget, the actual budget question was on the back side of the ballot. And many of the ballots came in with with no vote on the school budget. So it just goes to show you, I mean, it can be anything. It can be an issue with the budget that the community is unhappy about, and you have to keep voting, or it can be that you didn't really think about the impact of how it's presented on the piece of paper that goes in front of voters and how that might impact your vote. But you have to continue to vote until you have a passed budget. You can get, if you move into the start of the new school year, you can get some funds from the state based on your prior year budget. So obviously you can start to operate, but you have to continue to vote.
And one of the reasons is often turnout. And, I knew, Cheryl, you lost a budget vote. I didn't know it was that close. And if I lose a budget by 8 votes, I'm getting a copy of the exit checklist from each of the town clerks to see who voted and who didn't. And if I find, 100 teachers on that list that live in my district and didn't vote, then I'm more confident that it wasn't because we did something wrong with the budget. It's that we didn't turn the people out who needed to be turned out.
And we do that as well, Morgan. We get you can request the checklist from the town, and you can see just who's voting, and that is very informative. And we did concentrate on making sure and getting out the vote. In particular, we were looking at our families, voting, and really concentrating on getting information out via the schools to our families about the vote.
Well, Cheryl and Mark,
Passed by 200 the next time around. So
good.
Nice.
We're indebted to you, Cheryl and Morgan. Definitely appreciate your time and your preparation for this. We will share some feedback with you if we get that, and we'll make the video available to you. You might have people in your district, even board members, to share this with. You're welcome to stay for the conversation here we'll have over the next 25 to 30 minutes about effective meetings. I know, Morgan, as a former school board member, that's got to be interesting to be on one side of the dais and then on the other. And I would be very curious to hear you as we transition, kind of what could you share that, well, you used to think this as a school board member, but now as a business and finance manager, you actually think differently. Anything that might be helpful for folks to know?
That's a good question. I think this isn't exactly answering that, but one of the committees or subcommittees of the board that I never served on in those first 10 years was the policy committee. So we have 2 members from each board that sit on the policy committee, and that was a real loss. And that's a real great way, I think, for new board members to pretty quickly get a handle on the operation side of what we do. So I'd put that recommendation out to folks. And I think VSBA does a good job around roles and role creep and trying to train board members that that you have a different role when you're sitting at the board table than you do as a citizen. And certainly in our small towns, none of the voters care about that, and they're going to get to you in the grocery store, and they're going to get to you in the post office. And really being able to say, this is something that you should be running through the chain of command. Talk to your teacher, talk to your principal first, talk to the superintendent if it's something that needs to go to the board. And it's something that, as a new board member, I knew. Now, as part of the administration, I know what we have to do to pick up the pieces when people don't follow that.
Fascinating. Yeah, that living in that sort of aftermath when good governance kind of is dissolved a bit.
Mhm.
And that's really a great segue. I know, school board meetings are just one small sliver of the work and life of a school board member, but it is that public display of how the board functions and does its work. So thinking about this, and for new board members in particular, what do they most need to know and what do they need to know now? We've got people in the webinar who have no doubt been on the board for a year or two, because we had some last week. But there's a lot that were maybe just joining the board in March or April, and some are still having elections here in May. What's sort of square one? Nancy, Neil, anyone? Where do they start? What do they do first?
I'll chime in. I think the top two for me, right, is no Vermont open meeting law. And then the second one is, and this varies by board because it depends on how closely your board follows Robert's rules, but have a fundamental understanding of Robert's rules. Those are the two big ones in my mind, right? Because you want to be able to get to work, right? There's work that the board needs to do, and you don't want to be sidetracked by getting bogged down in process, right? So if you understand what is allowed and what isn't allowed with Vermont open meeting law, you won't get yourself into trouble by meeting when you weren't supposed to because you didn't warn it properly, or you didn't have a quorum, or you were trying to do something that you really shouldn't be doing. Like, know that stuff so that you can say, okay, we satisfied that, we're good there. Know how to run or be a participant in an effectively run meeting through Robert's rules, and then you can just get down and get your work done, right? And don't have to worry about that other stuff.
Nancy, what would you add to that? I heard open meetings law and Robert's rules. Know those two things to get off to a good start.
I think one of the things that brings to my mind when I first started that, even though I've been on other boards, but not a school board, which is really a whole different board. And so a couple of things came to mind is when you're looking at the agenda, which is usually the chair board is setting, or the superintendent, depending upon your school, I would guess. But when you're looking at those agendas, or the items that are on the agenda anyway, to think about what do I expect out of this? When I'm looking at this agenda item, am I trying to share information with the rest of the board and the public? Am I asking for information because I need some clarity? Or is this something that the board is going to have to make a decision on that night or that day? And that was a little bit harder for me because it was not the way that a lot of the boards that I had been on in the past for businesses, that wasn't our agenda level of where we were thinking. And so I think that that's really important for people to understand there too. And as Morgan says, because I'm one of those people, I am extremely, extremely active in my community, and I serve on with a lot of different organizations because thankfully I'm retired now, and I've got that extra time that you have, when you retire, and people do accost you. And if there's something that's a real hot issue in your community, in your local community, there would be nights that I've even sent things to Neil in the middle of the night and to my superintendent, to the board, and saying, my phone is blowing up here. What am I supposed to do? These people are looking to me. They know me. I know them in the community. And yet I can't speak for the board. And so, and that's been a real hard one for me to step back and say, I hear you.
So if I'm a new school board member and I've got an idea that I want my board to discuss, how do I get that to happen? How do I get my idea on the agenda next month?
for our board, we send it to the chair, who happens, well, we send it to our chair
So
and
you
say,
just
I would like to have this, on the agenda for our next meeting.
And then it's his or her decision whether to put it on the agenda, or does the chair always put everybody's idea on the agenda?
No, in our case, our chair discusses it with our superintendent, and they make a decision at that point whether it should be on the agenda or to call back. Like if I was presenting something or wanted to present something, they would call me back and say, Nancy, we've really been thinking about this, and yeah, we hear your concern, or we hear this is a really good idea, but, and then give me the reasons that it might not work and the reasons that they are choosing not to put it on the agenda.
Anything you would add to that, Neil?
No, we operate the exact same way. I think the only addition to that is that at the end of every meeting, we typically have, just before adjournment, if any board member has any new business or future agenda items that they would like to bring up. And so that's just an opportunity for that board member to bring up the idea or the request in a public session. So it's not just a conversation between the board member and the chair.
And that
So-
gives your administration a month to actually prepare for that discussion rather than having it sprung on them that night.
Oh, very good.
Mhm.
So speaking of sprung on them that night, how do you handle public comment? And is public comment an issue? Is it something to look forward to? What has been your experiences with public comment in school board meetings?
I'll jump in again. Is that okay, Neil? Right at the very start, as soon as our meeting is called to order, there is a statement that the chair reads, and it talks about public comment, and that there's going to be certain responses that you will be given from the chair or the clerk, whichever one is taking care of it that night. And we give them 5 minutes. And we say right up front, you're going to have 5 minutes. And then I can't remember all of them right off the top of the head, but it would be like, there would be no response, or it would just be, thank you very much. And we'll take this matter and investigate it a little bit further. Or I don't know, there's like 4 or 5 that we have developed, and we read that at every single meeting. And we do it right at the very start of the meeting. And then we used to have public comment at the start of the meeting, but now we've learned that it's much better to have the most important things at the top of the agenda. And we put the public comment towards the end of the meeting. So, and that also kind of, if someone's really got feather up their back, then they really want to keep just going on and on and on, and then it gets really heated. Then it's at the end of the meeting, and sometimes that helps to calm them down a little bit before they get up and have their public comment, which we don't have anything against public comment. It's just that we need to do the work of the board, and sometimes that's not what these people want us to do. And it's we're trying to educate our community a little bit about what we can and cannot do as a board. And that's been real interesting.
Nancy, what if you're sitting there as a new school board member and someone from the public has a feather up their back, and you know that you have the answer to this problem they're saying, can you respond? Do you respond? What does a new school board member do in that situation where they want to soothe that person or give them a different kind of answer?
That's been a real hard one.
What's the right thing to do?
I think as a school board member, the right thing to do is to acknowledge that, yes, I have heard what you have said, but now is not the time for us to talk about this. Maybe we could talk about this later. And then you get with your chair, your soup, and say, do we need to have a meeting with this person, or can I respond to this person without being a response from the board itself? Because we have governance policy and we have clerk that's supposed to do all of this kind of responding. But that puts a lot on one person. So we've come up with it. We'll get with the superintendent and or the clerk or the chair and decide if it's okay to sit down and sometimes, you know, just have them sleep on it that night. While they were sleeping on it that night, then the next morning they're not quite as adamant as they were the night before. But it's a difficult situation to be in, I think. It had always been for me because I'm that caregiver. I want to take care of the problems. I want to solve the problems. I want the people to be happy. And we can't always do that.
Well, now we're getting some questions in the chat. So very, very related. What if there's a comment from the public that's about an item that's on the agenda being discussed that night by the board?
So I'll jump in on that one. So for us, we actually have public comment policy that addresses that. So our policy specifically says that folks can, we have public comment at the beginning of the meeting. So if anybody wants to make public comment, then they are allowed to. But our policy also specifically says that community members or folks are allowed to provide public comment as we are discussing each agenda item as well. So the policy lays that out.
Is there a point in a meeting where if a lot of people are there from the community, maybe 10 or more, and they've all got sort of the same concern they're raising, does that change how it gets addressed in a board meeting?
Yeah, so in those instances before, what, you know, so in my previous, when I was the chair, what I would do in that case is if you start to see this same theme coming up over and over again from a few speakers, what I have done in the past is paused for a second and I've like, give me a show of hands. How many people are here to basically support the position that was just stated? And, you know, you'll see a bunch of hands go up, and as chair, I will make the very firm suggestion that if your opinion matches one that's already been stated, we can see it by your hand raised. We don't necessarily need you to come to the mic and say the same thing over again. And in most cases, that's helped to move things along.
Has it been your experience too that when a lot of people are at a meeting to speak to the same issue, that they've sort of been organized in advance? I mean, they didn't just happen to show up that night, but there was some organizing going on. So,
yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And you know, one of the things that, because we've had so much going on here in our town for the past couple of years, that has brought a lot of people out to the school board meetings, is that once a month now, in addition to our school board meeting, we have a community meeting, and it's run by the school board, and people can come and talk, and we will listen to them. We are not giving them any answers, but it's a chance. They have more than 5 minutes.
Nice.
And I think that has helped our community relations. And people are more responsive now to us when we say, yeah, you know, I really hear you, but that's not in our purview. We can't do that. That's not one of the things that we're allowed to do. And they can understand it. And then, and like I said, then they get a chance better to talk with us on one-on-one without it interfering with the business that we as a school board need to be doing.
Yeah, I love that idea of a listening session. I know our time will evaporate quickly, but Neil mentioned, you know, when getting on the board and getting right down to work, needing to know open meetings law, Robert's Rules of Order. What about your board packets? When do the board packets come? What kind of information is in there? I know when I was a school board member and the packet came, you know, and it was all big, thick envelope of paper. It was, okay, now where do I start? What's most important in these 100+ pages? Any guidance for what to do with those packets?
So first, if you're getting 100+ page packet, I would talk to your chair, because that's too much.
Yeah.
Yes.
What I would say is, you know, you kind of want to focus on all of it. I am hoping that at that point, right? You've got a good chair, and that the items that are on your agenda are really items that the board really needs to be either discussing or deciding on. Make sure that you're familiar with any material in the packet that's provided as backup that describes, whatever it is, the situation or what it is that you need to discuss or decide on. Review it, make sure you know it, have some questions in your mind, especially if it's an item that's up for decision, as to what questions do you need to get answered, right, for your own self to determine how you might vote on something. Thinking about it, I think, in that way helps to prepare you then for that moment in the meeting where you're going to be asked to vote on something and you need to know what your position is going to be.
Do your boards typically, if you have a question on an agenda item, do you send an email to the superintendent or board chair ahead of time? Say, I've got this question. Do you try to get that before the meeting or just wait till the meeting?
I've gone both ways. I think in that one, though, you have to be careful, which is why I go back to your open meeting law understanding before, right? Sending the email just to the chair for clarification is okay. What you don't want to do is start sending emails to the entire board as a whole, especially when folks are in there on a CC, and then you start to inadvertently create this back and forth communication that could be considered a meeting. So you don't want to do that. In general, understanding that your role on the board is a vote on that body, right? And so I think to a great extent, if you've got a question, it actually probably also benefits your other board members to know what that question was as well, and what the answer was to it. And bringing that up during the course of an open meeting, in my mind, is the best way to do that.
Good.
Agree. Yeah.
So let's talk just a little bit about kind of public decorum. We know that school board meetings are meetings held in public. They're not necessarily a public meeting. It's not a town hall meeting. It's a meeting of the board to do business on behalf of the district or the supervisory union. So how does a board navigate that, not just with the public, but among its members? What are some techniques for the board not to fall into snide remarks about each other or about anyone else, and just sort of maintain professional and a productive approach in front of the community?
We have a code of ethics that and a lot of it came from VSBA guidance as to how we're going to conduct ourselves. And we, at the end of each meeting, we have a monitoring report. How did we do? Was everybody given a chance to talk? Was everyone treated with respect? There's a list about 6 or 7 questions. And at the end of each meeting, before we adjourn, we go over that and make sure that we are still being professional and still taking care of business.
You decided as a board to adopt a code of ethics, and then do you look at that?
Oh, yes.
Kind of every year? Should we change
We have it in front of us at every board meeting.
Every board meeting, yeah.
We may not read it out loud every board meeting, but it's in front of each one of us every board meeting.
Okay, reminder.
Yep.
Neil, any tips or techniques as a new member or even veteran members?
Yeah, I think, some of it I think comes from modeling behavior, right? So you want to make sure that you've got a chair who's modeling good behavior, is allowing, a conversation to be robust and real, and people get to share their feelings and thoughts, but respectful as well too. And so I really, push a lot of that responsibility towards the chair to make sure that the conversation that's happening is a good one, and they can certainly step in if a board member may sort of stray a little bit from that. We also, like Nancy's board, we have a code of ethics. It's voluntary, but we ask board members to sign on right at the organizational meeting every year. So even for veteran board members, they're re-signing the code of ethics every year. And then I'll also say that we do a retreat annually, which is also an open meeting, but it's less formal. It allows board members to we'll do some icebreakers, board members get to know each other a little bit better. And when you know somebody else as an individual, as a person, another member of your community, I consider all of my board member colleagues right now friends. We know each other, we know their kids, or we know that they've got grandkids, and treat each other just with respect and as another member of your community.
Neil, I'd just like to underscore what you said there. I like to make sure in all of our webinars, we remind folks, it's been a tough 2 or 3 years here for people. There's not just the pandemic and everything associated with that, but certainly political divisions and unrest, as well as economic uncertainty. And just, folks are really going through a lot right now. And I think it's important to always remember, our colleagues at the dais, the administrators, those that are presenting to us, our community members, we never know exactly what they're going through. And the more that we can take time and effort to humanize everything and everyone around us, the more effective we can be, but the better world we can create in our corner of the world at the very least. So I appreciate you mentioning that. That's I think a lot of people misunderstand the opportunity that boards do have to get together and get acquainted that are not violations of the law. The meeting or the opportunity for them to be together at social events is not prohibited. There's a time where that needs to be announced and made public to the community, but there are a lot of different times. And I think that's super important to realize these are human beings too. And remembering our superintendent's a human being, right? And his or her staff. So is there anything else that you would say? We've only got 1 minute left in our scheduled time together. We'll end the recording and be happy to have a conversation if people have questions that they want to kind of take offline. We would love to entertain a little bit of that, but any final words for tips for new school board members?
Phil, I've got several requests to send people copies of the monitoring report that we do on ourselves at the end of each meeting. Would the easiest way be, because I've got to get 3 or 40, do you want me just to send them to Carrie and have Carrie send them out?
Yeah. Send it to Carrie and me, and we'll just include it
Okay.
in the email that probably goes out tomorrow.
Okay.
So that everybody has it.
Yeah, there you go. I'll send it out.
Yeah, Phil, I would say, so first off, congratulations to all the new board members, and congratulations maybe to all the board members that are re-upping and are going to be with us again. Do not hesitate to reach out to the VSBA if there's anything that you need. The reason that we're here is for you folks. And I want you to know, you could send me personally an email, you could send one to Nancy, but certainly get in touch with Phil, get in touch with Executive Director Sue Siglowski, Sandra Cameron, who's also on staff. We are all there to support you guys. That's why we do this. And so I want you to know that the VSBA is a resource that you can always turn to no matter what.
And thank you for that, Neil. There are a lot of resources available on our website. There's archived webinars that people should make note of. We do, I believe it's 11 fall regional meetings where we meet with each region a little more close and personal. And then we've got an annual meeting that's coming up in October, about the 3rd week of October for 2 days. We do that jointly with the Superintendents Association. And so there'll be programming specifically for school boards, timely, relevant, educational sessions. Well, thank you again to all of our panelists, certainly Nancy, Neil, Morgan, Cheryl. I really appreciate you sharing your time this evening with new school board members across the state of Vermont. And let us know what we can do to serve you. I'm going to end the recording, and like I say, stay here a few minutes in case people do have some questions or something we could help with. Thank you so much, Cheryl.